The card table had been cleared of everything but a single sheet of paper, and on that paper, in the dowager's own hand, was the price of a woman's life. Eleanor Whitcomb stood at the edge of the drawing-room at Haringly Court, her plain gray gown swallowed by the candlelight that glittered on the diamonds around her, and she understood in the space of one held breath that she had just been sold. Lady Sedgwick had not troubled to lower her voice. Across the room the men were still laughing over their cards, and one of them, a heavy man with a wet mouth and pale eyes, had turned to look at Eleanor the way a buyer looks at a horse whose teeth have just been checked. She did not move. She had learned in 2 years of living under this roof that stillness was the last thing a dispossessed woman owned outright. What the room did not know, what even the dowager did not know, was that the man who would have forbidden this with a single word was 3 days' ride away and had no notion his stepmother had put his father's ward up for auction in his absence. If you have ever watched someone decide your future across a room in a language of glances you were never meant to read, then you already know the particular cold that moved down Eleanor's spine that night. Stay with me. What the season believed about her was not the truth, and the truth was about to cost more than any of them had wagered. She had come to Haringly Court in the 3rd autumn after her father's death, brought there by a promise made between 2 men who were both now in their graves. The late Lord Sedgwick had been her father's dearest friend, and when the fever took Eleanor's father and left her with a mortgaged house and a name that creditors circled like crows, it was old Lord Sedgwick who had taken her in. He had signed papers, making her his ward. He had meant them to protect her. He could not have foreseen that he would follow her father into the churchyard within the year, nor that his second wife, the woman he had married late and unwisely, would read those same papers as a deed of ownership rather than a charge of care. To the household staff, Eleanor was the ward, spoken with a small pause before it, as though the word required examination. To Lady Sedgwick, she was a debt her late husband had left unpaid, a girl of no fortune, eating at a table that was no longer his to set, and to the season when the season thought of her at all, she was the poor Whitcomb girl, past her first bloom, dressed in colors that begged no one's attention. She had let them think it. There was a kind of safety in being overlooked, and she had wrapped herself in it the way she wrapped herself each morning in the gray merino that had once been her mother's traveling cloak. The man, laughing over the cards, was Lord Rutherford, and everything Eleanor knew of him she wished she did not. He owned a great cold house in the north, where 2 wives had gone in and neither had come out to any society that remembered them. He was rich in the particular way that made men careless, and he wanted a young woman of good blood and no protectors, and Lady Sedgwick had precisely such a woman sitting unwanted in her drawing-room. The arrangement had a tidy logic to it. Rutherford would settle a sum on the dowager that would keep Haringly Court's shutters painted, and its cellars full. Eleanor would be removed. The estate accounts would breathe. Everyone would profit but the girl, and the girl in the dowager's reckoning had never been anything but a column of expense. What Lady Sedgwick had not entered into her arithmetic was her stepson. Thomas Sedgwick, now Lord Sedgwick by his father's death, had inherited the title and the estate and the guardianship of one Eleanor all in the same black month, and he had accepted all 3 the way he accepted everything since the war, which was to say with a silence that the household had learned to read as coldness. He had come back from the peninsula with a scar through his left brow, and a way of standing at windows for a long time without speaking. The servants said he was hard. The dowager, his stepmother, said worse, and said it in that soft voice that made cruelty sound like concern. "He is not himself," she would murmur to callers. The war took something from him. She said it so often that even Eleanor had half believed it. In her first months there, before she had seen the other thing, the thing no one else seemed to notice. She had seen it first in the stable yard on a wet morning, when a groom was beating a lame carriage horse and Thomas had crossed the cobbles in 6 strides and taken the whip from the man's hand without raising his voice at all. She had seen it in the way he read his father's old letters by the library fire, and folded them, with a care that had nothing hard in it. A cold man, the household, had decided. Eleanor had begun to suspect that what they called cold was only a door held shut against a room too full to open. Thomas, however, was in the north himself, now gone to see about a flooded tenant farm, and he had left 3 days ago, and Lady Sedgwick had waited exactly until his carriage was out of the drive before she sent her invitations to Lord Rutherford. The paper on the card table was a settlement in all but signature. Eleanor had read it upside down as she cleared the glasses, which was a skill the dowager did not know she possessed, and the sums on it had made her hands go cold inside her gloves. She set the tray down before it could betray her. She said good night to the room in a voice that gave nothing away. And she climbed the servant's stair to the small, cold room at the top of the house that was hers only so long as she was useful. And she sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and she did not weep, because weeping was a thing you did, when there was someone to hear it and be moved. She had 6 days. That was what the paper had said, at the bottom, in the dowager's hand. Lord Rutherford would return on the 6th day to conclude the matter. Thomas was not expected back for a fortnight. I will tell you now that Eleanor did not spend those 6 days waiting to be rescued, because she had learned long ago that no one was coming, and a woman who learns that lesson early stops looking at the door. She spent the first of those days doing what she had always done, which was to make herself so quietly necessary that no one thought to watch her closely. She carried the household keys the housekeeper had begun to trust her with. She sat an hour with the late lord's aged spaniel, who would eat for no one else. She wrote 3 letters, and burned 2 of them. The 3rd letter she did not burn. It was to a woman named Mrs. Pettigrew, who had been housekeeper at Haringley Court in the old lord's time, and had been turned off without a character when the dowager took the reins, and who now kept a lodging-house in the market town 6 miles distant. Eleanor had visited her twice, on errands the dowager thought were to the linen draper. Mrs. Pettigrew knew the house's secrets the way old servants do in the walls, and the account books, and the things said over 30 years of carrying tea to a drawing-room. Eleanor's letter asked her a single question, and it was not a question about escape. It was a question about a name. The name was Rutherford, because Eleanor had remembered something, sitting in that cold room. She had remembered that the old Lord Thomas's father had once refused a man his door, and had done it in a fury. Eleanor's own father had described to her years later as the only time he had seen his friend truly frightened for someone. The man refused. The door had been a northern lord with 2 dead wives. Her father had not given the name. Her father had said the old lord swore that no daughter of any house he protected would ever cross that threshold, while he drew breath. The old lord was dead. His ward, though, was still his ward, and the papers that made her so had never been undone. The 2nd day brought the dowager to Eleanor's door in person, which was itself a kind of warning, for Lady Sedgwick did not climb stairs for anyone. She stood in the low doorway in dove-gray silk, her fan folded against her palm, and she looked at the plain room with the faint distaste of a woman inspecting a stall. "You have been a burden borne gladly," she said, in the voice that made every cruelty a courtesy. "But a young woman cannot remain a charge forever. Lord Rutherford has done you a great honor. I trust you understand what is owed to those who have kept you." Eleanor understood perfectly. She had understood since the drawing-room. Yet she folded her hands and lowered her eyes, and said only that she was grateful for the family's care, and she watched the dowager's shoulders ease at the sound of surrender, and she thought, behind her still face, that a woman who mistakes silence for consent has never once been silent herself. Rutherford came to dine on the 3rd evening, though he had no business coming so soon. And Eleanor understood that too. He had come to look at his purchase. The dining-room at Haringley Court had been opened for him, the long table laid with the plate the dowager kept for company, the candelabra polished till the flames doubled in the silver, and a fire built up so high that the room for once was warm. Eleanor had helped lay it. She had counted the covers and known, before she was told that she would be seated below the salt in the gray gown, where a poor relation was seated when a family wished to seem generous without seeming foolish. The dowager displayed her the way one displays a length of cloth one is willing to let go cheap, turning the conversation now and again toward Eleanor's accomplishments, her needlework, her steadiness, her lack of expectations, each virtue named, in a way that made it sound like a discount. Rutherford ate a great deal, and spoke little, and watched everything. Up close, he was worse than Eleanor had feared. His hands were soft and very white and moved slowly, and his pale eyes traveled the table with the unhurried attention of a man appraising rooms he already believed were his. He spoke to Eleanor twice across the whole of the meal. The first time he asked, over the soup, whether she rode. She said she did not, which was a lie, and kept her eyes on her plate, and felt rather than saw the small satisfaction that moved across his face, as though a woman who did not ride was a woman with one fewer way to leave a house in a hurry. Something in the way he received the lie told her she had guessed rightly, and that he preferred her helpless, and that helplessness in a wife was to him a comfort rather than a burden. The second time he leaned toward her over the candles between the removes, while the dowager was occupied with the carving and the footmen were at the far door, and he said low, in a voice pitched so that Lady Sedgwick might pretend not to hear it, that his house in the north was very quiet. He said the snow came early there and stayed late, and that the nearest neighbor was 11 miles distant over Bad Road, and that he found, on the whole, that quiet women kept best. He said it the way another man might have paid a compliment, to the room. He was all courtesy, a lord condescending to a dependent girl. To Eleanor, in that one lean sentence, he was the cold house and the 11 miles of bad road and the 2 wives who had gone in and not come out, and the door her guardian had died, still holding closed with the whole force of a frightened man. She did not flinch. She had learned, in 2 years under this roof, not to give a man like that the flinch he was fishing for, because the flinch was the thing they fed on, the small proof that they had reached you. She lifted her eyes to his, and she made them mild. And she said that the north must be very beautiful in the snow, and that she had always thought quiet a great luxury. She watched him hear it, and decide she was stupid, or at the least incurious, a girl too dull to understand what she was being told. And she was glad of it, because a woman, a man, believes stupid, is a woman he does not trouble to watch. And Eleanor had a great deal she meant to do unwatched. Mrs. Pettigrew's reply came on the 4th day, folded inside a delivery of table linen, and Eleanor read it standing in the cold larder with her heart going hard against her ribs. The old housekeeper had written plainly, in a hand cramped by age. She confirmed what Eleanor had only guessed. The old lord had indeed refused Rutherford his house, and the reason had been the first wife, a girl of 18 married out of a family that owed Rutherford money. Dead, within 2 years of a fall, no servant in that house had believed was a fall. There had been no proof. There was never proof, with a man rich enough to close mouths. The old lord had believed it, all the same, and had said so, and had written it into a letter he entrusted to his solicitor, a letter naming Rutherford, and forbidding any ward or daughter of his blood or charge to be given to that man under any inducement whatsoever. The letter still existed. Mrs. Pettigrew was almost certain of it. It would be with the solicitor, a Mr. Alderton in the county town, among the old lord's sealed papers, the ones the dowager had never been able to lay her hands on because a guardian's private instructions passed not to a widow, but to the heir, to Thomas. Eleanor stood in the coal larder and understood 2 things at once, and the second was harder than the first. The first was that there was a weapon, a real one, made of paper, and a dead man's foresight that could stop this. The second was that she could not reach it. She could not ride to the county town without the dowager knowing before her horse cleared the gate. She could not write to a solicitor who had no reason to answer a nameless ward and every reason to defer to the family that paid his bills. The letter that could save her was locked in the one hand that was 3 days' ride away and had no idea it held her life. That night the household, aside from the dowager, gathered in the servants' hall, as it did on the cook's birthday, and Eleanor sat among them because she had never quite belonged upstairs and had made herself half belong down here. Quote, and it was there, over the cook's seed cake, that the coachman's boy said the thing that changed everything. He said he'd carried a message that morning to the posting inn on the North Road from her ladyship, and that it was to hold a room for Lord Rutherford's man on the 6th night, for there'd be a lady travelling north after. After. Not a wedding. Not banns read. Not a settlement signed before witnesses in the proper way. A lady travelling north, quietly, in the dark with a man-servant to see it done. The dowager did not mean to marry Eleanor to Rutherford at all. She meant to send her, and let the marriage be whatever Rutherford chose to make it once she was 100 miles from anyone who had ever known her name. Eleanor set down her fork. The seed cake had gone to ash in her mouth, and a thing that had been coiled quiet in her for 2 years. Under all the stillness and the lowered eyes, uncoiled at last and stood up. She would not go north. She had decided it as plainly as she had ever decided anything. Deciding, though, was the easy part, and Eleanor was not a fool who mistook resolve for a plan. She lay awake that 4th night and turned every road over in her mind, and every road came back to the same wall. She had no money of her own. She had no family that would not send her back for the sake of not offending the Sedgwicks. The law that made her a ward made her until she was 21, a thing to be disposed of by her guardian, and her guardian was not the dowager, whatever the dowager pretended, and that was the whole of Eleanor's hope and the whole of her helplessness at once. Only Thomas could stop it. Only the letter in Thomas's keeping could arm him too. And both were in the north, in the dark, 3 days away. So she would send for him. It was the only door left, and she would put her whole weight against it. The 5th morning Eleanor rose before the house, when the sky over the beechwood was still the color of pewter, and the frost lay white on the yard cobbles. And she went down the back stair in her mother's grey cloak, and found the one person at Haringley Court she was almost sure of. His name was Jim, and he was the undergroom, a boy of 16 with a stammer that had made the dowager pass him over for the box and set an older, duller man there in his place. Eleanor, who knew from the inside what it was to be counted for less than you were, had been quietly kind to him for 2 years. She had taught him his letters and stolen half-hours in the tack-room, tracing them on the back of a feed ledger, and he had come, slowly, to read. He had brought her the first primrose from the south bank every spring since, laid on the sill of the still-room window without a word, because words came hard to him and primroses did not. She found him forking down hay by lantern light, and she stood with him in the cold and told him plainly what was being done to her. She did not soften it. She had learned that the people the world overlooks are the very ones who see everything, and Jem had already half guessed, from the black carriage bespoke, and the room held at the posting inn, and the way the whole servants' hall had gone quiet, whenever her name was set. He listened with the fork gone, still in his hands, and his jaw worked, and when she had finished, he did not answer at once. She told him what she meant to ask and how much it cost. She asked him to ride to the North Road and carry a letter to Lord Sedgwick to find him at whatever posting inn the flooded farm had sent him to, and to put the letter in his hand and no others. It was a great deal to ask of a boy. If he were caught at it, he would be turned off without a character, as Mrs. Pettigrew had been, cast out of the only place he had ever known, and a boy with a stammer and no character did not find another place easily in a hard county. Eleanor said, all of it. She would not let him go into a danger he had not been shown the whole of. Jem set the fork against the wall, and looked at her, and his face, which the household read as slow, was not slow at all, only careful, and he said without a single catch in the word, that he would go. Some things a body could say clear, he told her when they mattered enough, and then he stammered badly over the next 3 words. And they both let it pass, because the important thing had already been said whole. Eleanor wrote the letter in the tack-room by lantern light, her fingers stiff with cold. She did not plead. She was too proud for pleading and too wise to think it would move a man like Thomas anyway. She wrote what had happened in the plainest words she had: the card table, the settlement, the 6th night, the room held at the posting inn, the name Rutherford. And then she wrote the one thing she had never said to him or to anyone in that house in 2 years of lowered eyes. She wrote that his father had died, refusing this exact man his door, and that there was a letter in Mr. Alderton's keeping that said so, and that it was addressed to the heir, which was to say to Thomas himself, and that if he did not come, no one else could. She sealed it with a wafer and gave it to Jem, and she watched him lead the horse out the back way through the beechwood so the sound of the hooves would not carry to the house. And she stood in the empty yard as the light came up and understood that she had just spent the last of what she had. 3 days there and back, at the least. Rutherford's man came on the 6th night. The arithmetic did not work, and Eleanor had always been good at arithmetic. Jem could not reach the north and return with Thomas before the carriage came for her. What she had bought with her letter was not rescue. It was a witness. If she vanished north, Thomas would at least know she had not gone willingly, and he would have his father's letter, and he would come after her into that cold house with the law in his hand. It was not nothing. It was not enough, though, and Eleanor knew it, standing in the yard, and she made herself look at the not enough squarely because she had never been able to bear a comfort that was a lie. She had 1 night and 1 day left, and she was still at Haringley Court, and the carriage was still coming. The 6th day was very long and very quiet. The dowager was almost gentle, the way people are gentle to a thing they are about to be rid of. She had Eleanor's few good things packed, or the things she called good, and she spoke of Lord Rutherford's generosity, and once, only once, when she thought Eleanor was not looking, she stood at the window with her fan still in her hand and her face unguarded, and Eleanor saw in it not triumph, but a kind of tired arithmetic. A woman balancing a book that had never balanced, choosing the girl because the girl was the entry she could strike out. It did not make Eleanor forgive her. It made her understand all the same, and understanding is a colder thing than forgiveness, and lasts longer. Dusk came early, as it does in the late year. The carriage that came up the drive was black and well sprung, and had no crest on the door, and the man who stepped down from it was not Rutherford, but Rutherford's servant, a spare grey man with a manner smoother than his master's and therefore worse. He presented Lady Sedgwick with a folded paper, and a small, heavy purse. And the purse was the whole of the matter, and Eleanor watched the dowager's hand close over it, and knew the last account was settled. She was brought down to the hall in her cloak. Her box was already strapped behind. The grey man looked at her once, the way the customs man looks at a parcel, and turned to hand her up into the dark of the carriage. And the beechwood at the bottom of the drive gave up the sound of a horse ridden hard. The grey man's hand tightened on her elbow, a small reflex, and Eleanor felt him turn his head toward the sound before she did. It carried up the frozen drive, through the still cold air the way sound carries on winter nights, a drum of hooves on iron-hard ground, and it was not the measured trot of a caller. It was a horse, being asked for everything it had. Eleanor stood very still on the carriage step, half-handed up into the dark, and she counted the beat of it. And she knew the difference by now, after 2 years of learning the sounds of this house from the outside of every warm room in it. It was not 1 horse, it was 2, and then behind the 2 there was more. The swing of a lantern coming up through the beeches, throwing the bare trunks into brief gold and letting them fall dark again. The first rider was off his mount before it had fully stopped, half falling and catching himself against the animal's steaming shoulder, and even in the poor light of the hall lamps, Eleanor knew the set of those shoulders. It was Thomas Mudd to the thigh, his horse blown to a lather. 3 days and 2 nights of hard riding written plainly in his face. Behind him a second man came off a hired hack, more slowly, stiff with cold and unaccustomed to the saddle, clutching a leather case against his chest with both arms as though it were the only warm thing left in the world, and would not be given up for anything. He had come. The arithmetic that could not work had worked, because Eleanor had reckoned 3 days there and back, and had not reckoned on a man who did not sleep, who changed horses at every posting inn and rode through 2 nights to do in half the time what any sane man would have done in whole. Jem had found him on the north road on the evening of the 2nd day, already turning south, for the flooded farm had settled quicker than expected, and Thomas had been a day nearer home than anyone at Haringley knew. The letter had reached him at a crossroads inn, He had not finished reading it before he called for a horse. What happened in the hall of Haringly Court that night happened without a single blow struck, and I will ask you to remember that, because it is the whole shape of the thing. Thomas Sedgwick did not lay a hand on Rutherford's man. He walked into the hall, still in his riding mud, and the household drew back from him without being told to, and he looked at the purse in his stepmother's hand, and at the girl in the cloak on the step, and at the black carriage with no crest, and he understood the whole of it in one long silence. The dowager recovered first. She was very good. In her way, she began to speak of an arrangement, of what was owed, of a young woman's future secured, of nothing having been done that any guardian might not do, and Eleanor watched Thomas let her finish, which was its own kind of mercy. And then she watched him not answer his stepmother at all. He crossed the hall to Eleanor. Instead he looked at her, and there was nothing cold in it. There had never been anything cold in it. And he said her name. Just that. Eleanor. The given name he had never once used in 2 years of correct address. Spoken low, and it undid something in her that all the dowager's cruelty had not been able to reach, because it was the sound of being seen by the one person in that house whose seeing counted. Then he turned to the room, and to the gray man, and to his stepmother with her purse. And he said, the thing that ended it, he said it once, and quietly. And it was not a speech. She is my father's ward and mine, and she goes nowhere. The gray man began to speak of the settlement, of moneys advanced, of an agreement made in good faith. And the second rider, the sober man in the dark coat, stepped forward and set his leather case upon the hall table and opened it. And he was Mr. She. Alderton, the solicitor, whom Thomas had roused from his bed at midnight 2 nights running and carried south with him, and out of the case he drew a letter, yellowed, sealed with the old lord's own seal, and he read from it in the level voice of a man who has read many last wishes. He read the late Lord Sedgwick's instruction, written and witnessed, forbidding his ward Eleanor Whitcomb to be given in marriage or sent from his family's protection to Lord Rutherford of the North by any inducement for cause the writer held to be grave and would answer for before God. He read the date. He read the witnesses. He folded it again. The purse in the dowager's hand had become a very heavy thing. No settlement could stand against a guardian's written instruction, lodged before the ward was ever brought under this roof, and the dowager had never held the guardianship at all, and every soul in the hall understood it, now including the gray man who was already calculating the distance to his carriage. Rutherford's servant withdrew with the smoothness of a man well practiced in leaving before an account came due. The purse went back into the case it had come from. The black carriage went back down the drive empty, and the sound of it faded into the beechwood, and it did not come again. Lady Sedgwick did not weep or rage. She was not that kind of woman. She stood in the hall with her fan gone, still, and understood that the order she had spent her whole life inside had for once, in this one hall, not held. Thomas did not humiliate her. He told her in the same level voice that she would remove to the dower house at the far end of the park, and that she would keep her jointure and her dignity and nothing of the management of Haringly Court, and that they would not speak of this again. It was more mercy than she had shown, and she seemed to know it, and she went up the stairs without another word, and something in the house eased as she climbed, as though a window, long painted shut, had finally been forced open to the cold, clean air. I have told you the season believed a lie about Eleanor, and here is the truth the season never learned, because the truth did not happen in a ballroom where the season could see it. It happened 3 nights later in the library at Haringly Court by a fire that had been let burn low. Eleanor had not been able to sleep. She had come down for a book and found the room already occupied. Thomas at the window with his father's spaniel asleep at his boots, looking out at the snow that had begun that evening and was laying itself over the park in a silence you could almost hear. He did not send her away. He asked her without turning whether she was cold, and when she said she was not, he crossed the room and put another log on the fire anyway, and she understood by now that this was how he said the things he could not say, in the language of "come inside and sit down and let me see you warm." They spoke a long time. In the low voices the sleeping house allowed, the fire settling between them, and the snow at the black window laying itself deeper over the park. She sat in the chair by the hearth, and he stood at first by the mantel. And then, when the talk turned from the small matters to the large ones, he came and sat in the chair opposite, close enough that she could see the firelight move in the old scar through his brow. She was aware, in the way the body is aware before the mind will grant it, of exactly where he was, of the warmth of him across the small space, of the fact that no one in the world knew they were both awake in this room and no chaperone stood at any door. Propriety had no purchase in a snowbound library at 2 in the morning. There was only the fire, and the 2 chairs. And the truth, he had never told anyone. He told it to her at last. The thing the household had spent 2 years failing to guess. He told her about the war, and about a young ensign who had served under his command, a boy no older than Jem, with the same careful slowness and the same way of coloring when he was praised. He told her how he had sent that boy forward on an order he had known in his own gut was ill-judged, and had given anyway because his own commander had required it, and a soldier does not refuse, and how the boy had gone forward trusting him and had not come back. He told her he had carried the boy's watch in his breast pocket for 3 years, and had not been able to give it up, and had not been able to say why to anyone who asked. His voice, which the household called cold and level, was neither cold nor level now. It broke once, on the word forward, and he stopped, and mastered it, and went on. That was the thing the household had named coldness, and it was not coldness at all. It was a man who had learned in the worst way what it cost to fail someone, who had trusted him to see them safe, and who had come home from that war resolved, in the marrow of him, never to fail so again. And who had then been forced to stand 3 days' ride distant and watch, helpless with the miles, as his own house set about failing a girl in almost exactly the way he could not bear. When he understood that she saw it, all of it, the whole shape of the grief he had carried so long, something in his face gave way, not into weeping, for he was not a man who wept, but into a kind of openness that was harder to look at than tears. And Eleanor, who had held herself still through the card table and the leaned sentence over the candles and the black carriage on the step, who had not wept through any of it because weeping was a thing you did when there was someone to be moved by it, found that there was, now, someone. She had wanted, she understood, sitting there, not to be rescued at all. She had wanted to be seen, which was a larger and more frightening thing, and here in the firelight she was being seen, and she found she wanted him nearer, wanted it plainly and without excuse, the way she had not let herself want anything in 2 guarded years. She did not weep in the end, either. She reached across the small distance between the 2 chairs, and took his hand, which was a thing no drawing-room, and no season, and no propriety would ever have allowed, and which the empty, snowbound library allowed entirely. His hand was cold from the window and rough from the rains, and it turned in hers and closed, and she felt the pulse in his wrist quicken under her fingers and knew that her own had done the same. For a long moment neither of them said a word, because there was nothing that needed saying that the 2 hands were not already saying better, and to have spoken would have been to make small a thing that was, in that silence, exactly the size it needed to be. Once, in that long quiet, he lifted his free hand as though he would touch her face, his fingers coming up into the firelight and stopping a bare inch from her cheek, close enough that she felt the warmth of the palm without the touch of it. And he held it there, and then he let it fall again without arriving, because they both understood that some thresholds once crossed could not be uncrossed, and that this was not the night for it. She was glad of the not arriving. It told her more than an embrace would have. A man who could stop his own hand an inch from what he wanted was a man who would never take from her a thing she had not freely given. And after Rutherford's soft white hands moving over the dinner table like a man counting his rooms, the restraint of that stopped hand was worth more to Eleanor than any words of love could have been. I will not pretend they spoke of love that night, because they did not. Not in words. Words came later, in the spring when the guardianship gave way to a courtship. No one had arranged, and everyone at Harringley seemed to have expected all along. What passed in the library that night was smaller and larger than a declaration. It was the moment Eleanor stopped waiting for the door and understood that the door had been standing open a long while, held by a man who did not know how to say, "Come in," and so had only ever said, "Sit down and eat something, and you are cold." The snow fell all that night and into the morning. By the first thaw, the dowager was settled in the dower house, with her fan and her jointure and her diminished kingdom, and had begun, in the way of such women, to speak of Eleanor to callers as a girl she had always known would do well, which was its own quiet correction, and cost her more than she would ever admit. Mrs. Pettigrew was written to, and offered her old place, and came back to Herringley Court to find the linen presses in order, and a young mistress who thanked the staff by name. Jem was made head groom before he was 20, stammer and all, and it was noticed that the new Lady Sedgwick would trust the box to no one else. And on a certain evening, the following winter, with the snow come round again, and the fire high, and the old spaniel gone grey at the muzzle, and asleep on the hearth where he had always slept, Thomas took from a drawer in the library desk a thing he had carried a long time. It was the young ensign's watch, its case worn smooth. He did not speak of the war. He only wound it once and set it on the mantel where the firelight could reach it, and left it there ticking, in the warm room, among the living. Eleanor understood what it meant. It meant the door was open now, for good, and the room behind it need never be shut again, and the boy he had carried so long could be set down at last in a house that had learned how to keep the people inside it safe. She came and stood beside him at the fire. Outside, the snow went on falling over the park and the dower house and the beechwood and the road north, that no carriage would ever again carry her down. Inside there was the fire and the watch ticking on the mantel, and the two of them, and the whole warm length of a life that no one had arranged and no one could now undo. If Eleanor's story stayed with you, stay a moment more and tell me the part that did. I read every one, and thank you for staying to the end of it here, by the fire, where the story always meant to bring you.